My first memories of Cliff Richard and the Shadows are from my mum and dad's record collection. I had FBI by the Shadows, which I loved, and Travelling Light by Cliff, with Dynamite on the other side, which was a really good rocker, which is my dad's favourite. I think that's why I bought it. But it's odd because this would have been in the very early 70s, and Cliff was on TV a lot then doing his Saturday night light entertainment show. And so when I was a kid, him and Hank Marvin just seemed like comedians to me, and I didn't really equate the two things at all. I knew it was the same people, but the eras were so different, even though it was only like 10, 15 years apart. Cliff was maybe the first person in Britain to really look like a rock and roller. He had his bright pink satin jacket that he wore at the Two Eyes, and on Oh Boy, even though Oh Boy would have been seen in black and white. So he really dressed the part and he looked the part. He never smiled for the first few singles. He basically wanted to be Elvis, like pretty much every British rock and roll singer. But prior to him, there was only really Tommy Steele, who was the first British rock and roller, but went to night entertainment really, really quickly. So for the first few singles, Cliff really was, he was the real deal, and he bought Hank Marvin a Fender Stratocaster, which was maybe the first one in Britain as well, because you couldn't import them. There was a ban, and somehow he got around that because he was becoming famous. Somehow he got around it. So I mean, really, the sound of the Shadows is largely down to Cliff's generosity as well. The turning point for Cliff Richard, I think, was Living Doll, which was a huge hit and sounded nothing like his first few singles, which were all rockers. It was written by Lionel Bart, who would then go on to write Oliver and become famous for musicals. So he wasn't really a rock and roll songwriter either. And at that point, Cliff became clean cut Cliff that everybody thinks he's always been like that. But it was there was a good year there where he probably wasn't seen as somebody you want your daughters to go out with. It was only after Living Doll really, and then there was a lot more ballads. His records were cut between ballads and rock and roll songs. The ballads became more and more prevalent over the next few years. Cliff was the biggest pop star in Britain by the time they made the Young Ones. 1960, him and the Shadows were number one in the chart for basically half the year, and the Young Ones was his first really big film. Espresso Bongo was a great film, but it wasn't really just a Cliff vehicle, whereas the Young Ones clearly was. The opening sequence of Summer Holiday is really strong, and it was less than a decade after rationing ended, so I think it's showing Britain still looking very post-war, with like a brass band on the pier in the pouring rain, and it's easy to see how Summer Holiday would have looked very idealistic and not really futuristic, because it's still quite make do and mend. Having a holiday on a done up Route Master is not very Hollywood, but it's a very English film, and I think the opening sequence sets that up very nicely.
I've got it!
Got what?
This bus! London Transport said okay.
It's black and white for a start, like The Wizard of Oz, but it changes into colour very quickly as soon as Cliff comes on screen. So you see a big red double-decker bus, and everything's coloured from that point on. Cliff's acting is noticeably better. He's much more confident in The Young Ones and Summer Holiday than he is in Espresso Bongo. I think possibly because he's playing somebody who's closer to the real-life Cliff. He's hanging around with the Shadows. It basically seems like an extension of their everyday life.
Fellas, we just like to say that on behalf of the four of us that, well, we'd never have made it without you, would we, chaps?
No.
Definitely not.
It just goes to show you can't do without friends.
No, I promise we won't forget you.
We'll send you postcards.
So long, chaps.
Thanks for the great job.
See you when we get back, fellas.
See you, fellas. Thanks. Cheers.
See you, fellas.
Thanks for everything. Bye, boys. Cheers. Ta-ra, bye.
Who forgot to fill the tank?
It's a very nice premise, just driving across Europe in a bus, heading to Athens, a converted bus with Cliff doing all the driving for you. It's a nice idea, and I think that hasn't really gone away. So it does stand up. It wasn't a new genre for pop stars to be in films. I mean, you can go back to Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, and for rock era singers, Elvis had been doing it since 1956, I think, 57. So it was new for rock and roll singers. But I think basically when you got to the point where you could be a film star, then you were a huge pop star. You got to that level, going all the way through to Madonna and Ed Sheeran's in a film now. It's like you get to a certain level, then you're gonna make a film. But I think that showed how big he was. There was no big films for Adam Faith or Billy Fury, who were his two rivals at the time. They made films, but nothing like as big.
We're all going on a summer holiday. No more working for a week or two. Fun and laughter on a summer holiday. No more worries for me or you for a week or two. It was important to have a big hit song from the film. I think if your one souvenir you could take away from seeing the film at the cinema was to buy a record. So you wanted a big hit song, so you had The Young Ones and Summer Holiday, both the theme tunes, absolutely massive, both number one hits. And both films had another single. In Summer Holiday, it's Bachelor Boy, and The Next Time was a double A side and another number one. Just after Love Me Do charted, so it's kind of just on the cusp of before the Beatles break through and change things. There's a definite pre-Beatles sensibility about The Young Ones and Summer Holiday. I mean, for a start, Cliff doesn't even get to kiss a girl in either of them, let alone do anything more than that. So they're not anything to do with the permissive 60s. It's definitely a previous era. It's the end of a previous era, but it's at the same time they're both really enjoyable films now. They're very, very simple and very light in the best sense. So you'd really have to be quite churlish not to get some enjoyment out of either of them, really. When Summer Holiday came out, the first half of 1963, I think Cliff had two number ones. The Shadows had a number one. Jet Harris and Tony Meehan, who'd been in the Shadows, had a number one. And that was basically the first few months of 1963. They dominated it. Once Please Please Me came out and the Beatles took over the rest of the chart in 1963, that was basically it. And Cliff had two more number ones in the whole of the 60s after that. So it was really fundamentally changed. He wouldn't have got much new fan base after that, I guess. It would just be residual fans still buying his records. And he did better than other pre-Beatles stars. He did stay on TV and in the public eye on the charts till the mid-70s, really, continually. But it was a real dip. Summer Holiday really looks much more like the films that went before it than the films that came after it, I think. If you think of musicals, it's got much more in common with Singing in the Rain than it has with A Hard Day's Night, which was only a year later, but feels like a different world. So yeah, it does feel like the end of an era, really, Summer Holiday.